the embargo against Cuba, or the blockade, how we call it in Cuba, has been reinforced by the previous administration, by the Trump administration, with more than 243 new actions to reinforce the whole policy of the embargo, which have been maintained by the current administration. So that there has not been any significant movement in order to make things more flexible or to open up the very strict policy against Cuba. So I would say it's pretty relevant, the occasion, not only because the policy remains in place, but also because it has been reinforced during the last 4 years, and we have to take also into account the context of the pandemic. So everybody was at odds with the pandemic, which has a very significant impact for every country, including developed countries. And then that particular situation was used by the past administration, but even by the current administration, to still put more pressure on Cuba and to make things, particularly from the social point of view, to blow up in Cuba and to create a situation of ingovernance in the country. The U.S. is always confronted by other delegations, by other governments, in relation to their policy against Cuba because of the extraterritorial impact of a U.S. blockade. Cuba not only is that we cannot trade with the U.S., but we cannot have a normal relationship with other countries because of the impact of the extraterritorial nature. Companies from Europe, companies from Asia are persecuted, are fined. They cannot have a normal relationship with Cuba because then they have to confront with the U.S. legislation, and they are victim of very, very huge fines by the Treasury, by the U.S. Treasury.
I was reading the statement from the U.S. Mission to the United Nations from last year's vote, and the ambassador said that it's not true that the sanctions and blockade stop humanitarian assistance or stop food and medicine from going to Cuba. I expect they'll say something similar this year. How would you respond to this idea that the sanctions still allow food and medicine to enter Cuba?
I could use a very popular phrase here in the U.S., but I would put it diplomatically. That is blunt lie. Because the embargo in Cuba, or the blockade against Cuba, has a huge humanitarian impact on the Cuban population. I would just refer to an example, very, very close example, which is the pandemic. And we couldn't access the U.S. market to acquire such a thing like medicinal oxygen when we faced an oxygen crisis in Cuba during the pandemic. We asked for authorization to buy, to let us to buy oxygen in the U.S., and we were neglected that. We neglected that authorization, and that was a very humanitarian thing. We were supposed to receive, there were companies, there were non-governmental organizations that were ready to provide Cuba a lot of stuff, a lot of spare parts for hospitals, for example, during the pandemic. We had the case of a very significant Chinese company. They were ready. They even sent the products to Cuba. Those products never reached Cuban ports because of the U.S. embargo in Cuba. And that was humanitarian assistance to Cuba in a context where Cuba not only could not access the U.S. market, but even companies in Europe, companies with whom we had traditionally had a relationship, a trading relationship, we could not access that product. We could not access the ventilator of Swiss company because they had just been acquired a mix with U.S. companies. So the blockade is the single most important obstacle to the development of Cuba, and the single most important impediment to kickstart or to jump from where we are economically and socially. the achievements of Cuba, even with the blockade. We have a life expectancy at the level of developed countries. Infant mortality rate in Cuba traditionally, historically, if you take the median, is higher than the US. We have surpassed in infant mortality rate the US. If you look at literacy rate, it's at the level, it's higher than the US. So your question is quite pertinent. Where we would be if it was not because of the blockade? Well, that is very hypothetical, but one can imagine if we have been able to achieve those with our own resources, and yes, in many instances with international cooperation as well, but primarily with our own efforts and with our own human resources, because that is one of the things where Cuba has invested more in human resources. And that is the explanation, because we have been able to produce 5 vaccine candidates, and 3 of them already turned into vaccine. So where we would be? That is the 1 million question. All what I can say that, the social and the living situation of the Cuban people would be totally different, significantly different from all point of view.